You to the April 9th regularly scheduled Planning Commission. If you would, please stand for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Great time.
Okay. All right, thank you very much. Mr. Myers, are there any changes to the agenda?
Yes, Mr. Chair, for item number 3, which is PDR-14-28(Z)(P), which is DTS number 2014-0503, we have a revised project name, and the previous name was McClure Properties Ltd. Honore Lockwood, and it's been revised to McClure Properties Ltd. McClure Honore Lockwood. We also have a public comment letter attached, and then we have the future land use and zoning maps are attached with the new name, and that's it for changes.
Thank you, Mr. Meyer. Mr. Clegg, are there any changes from the County Attorney's Office?
No, sir.
Thank you very much. Next item on the agenda is the minutes.
I'll make a motion.
Yes,
Make a motion to approve the minutes of March 12, 2015.
Have a motion on
Second.
minutes? Second by Mr. DeLesline. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Chair votes aye. Minutes pass. Next item on the agenda are citizen comments. These are comments that are related to items not on the agenda. Is there anybody that would like to speak on any items that are not on today's agenda? Seeing none, we're going to move to the next item. Ms. Clerk's office. Could you please establish the rules for the process?
Good morning.
Good morning.
The applicant is entitled to 15 minutes for presentation and 5 minutes for rebuttal. Individuals may speak for 3 minutes, and anyone representing a group or organization of 5 or more members may speak for 10 minutes. If you represent a group, please state the group you represent and provide written authority to speak on behalf of the group. When you step to the podium, please state your name and whether or not you've been sworn. Anyone wishing to address the Planning Commission at this time, please stand while I administer the oath. Do you swear or affirm that the factual statements and factual representations which you're about to present to this board will be truthful and accurate?
I do.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. All right, we're going to move on to the consent agenda. Mr. Meyer, if you could, please read item number 2 into the record.
Okay, Mr. Chair, item number 2 is PDRV-14-29(P), which is Timberline RV Park, DTS number 2014-0521. This is approving a preliminary site plan for Phase 2 of Timberline RV Park, consisting of an additional 41 RV spaces and 15 mobile home spaces for a total of 56 additional spaces on a total project site of approximately 11.92 acres. This makes a total of 105 RV and mobile home spaces. Phase 1 was 6.54 acres and 47 RV spaces, 1 mobile home space, and a 2-story, 5,000 square foot amenity storm center, shelter, caretaker apartment. And is located at 7500 SR 64 East, Bradenton, in the PDRV Planned Development Recreational Vehicle Zoning District.
Thank you, Mr. Meyer. Is there anybody in the public that wishes to speak either for or against this project? Is there anybody in the public who would like to speak? Seeing none, we're going to move to the next item. Mr. Meyer, could you please read item number 3 into the record?
Yes, Mr. Chair, this item number 3 is PDRV 14-28(Z)(P), which is DTS number 2014-0503, and this is a rezone of approximately 18.64 acres from PDC WPEST, which is Planned Development Commercial Evers Reservoir Watershed Protection Special Treatment Overlay District zoning, to the PDR, which is Planned Development Residential Zoning District, retaining the WPEST overlay districts, and approving a preliminary site plan for 92 lots for single-family detached dwelling units. The site is at the southwest corner of 63rd Avenue East and Lockwood Ridge Road, Bradenton.
Thank you, Mr. Meyer. Again, is there anybody in the public who wishes to speak for or against this item? Is there anybody in the public who would like to speak on this item? Seeing none, the chair will entertain a motion.
Mr. Chair,
Mr. DeLisle.
I move to recommend approval of the consent agenda.
Thank you. There's a motion on the floor. Is there a second? Ms. Lukowiak, second. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Chair votes aye. Motion carries. Thank you. All right, that concludes our consent agenda. We're going to move on to the regular agenda, and that is Land Development Code rewrite. And Mr. Osborne, you'll be presenting this information.
Yes, sir, I'll start out. We also have Pat Tyeski, our Land Development Code Consultant, and Mr. Clegg also has a few comments. If I go get the slideshow up, please. Thank you. Again, I'm John Osborne, the planning official for the county. To give you a little background information, I'll talk through some history of where we've been and what progress we've made so far with our code rewrite. Our county attorney, Mr. Clegg, will also provide some comments, and then the last presenter will be Ms. Tyeski, who is our land development code consultant, and she'll go over the specifics of the code rewrite and our future schedule. When we started out this process several years ago, we had grand plans for a new code with a lot of changes, being very progressive. We came out with some drafts early on, and it became pretty evident pretty quick that the drafts it was a good plan, good code. However, the changes were very difficult to understand. If you opened up the document in Microsoft Word and tracked changes, you couldn't find, it was hard to figure out what went to what and what changed. And we got some reaction from the public, and they're like, it's a little too much, a little too soon. So what we decided to do is we decided to take a step back. But you can see in the original scope here, we had a very comprehensive list of things that we were going to do, and we will get to those items in the future. But for this phase now, we've actually taken the top 6 items, which includes the reorganization of the chapters. So as you look and search through the Land Development Code, you actually find what you're looking for in a logical place. When I was a staff planner and back in the 90s and actually reviewed projects and presented them to the board, it was very difficult as you went through projects and went through the code, trying to make sure that you covered everything you were supposed to cover. And when I first started, we didn't have the stuff in PDF format. You just had a big code on your desk. So to actually go through this 900,000 page document and make sure you cover everything, it took a lot of time. And sometimes during a public hearing, certain commissioners would get up and start doing, we called it the code walk, to go grab the code off the shelf. And you're like, oh no, what did I miss? And so the changes we're making will provide the information in a much more reliable place, puts much more certainty, and it also adds certainty to the public. And when somebody looks up something in our land development code, hopefully it'll be in the right place where you would expect it to find it. There wouldn't be some other odd thing hidden somewhere else in the code, which our current code has a lot of that today. Not intention is of that to be hidden, but it's just not always in the logical place you'd look for something. We've also addressed some of the inconsistencies internally to the code as well with these changes. We've also relocated some things to the engineering standards manuals, which you all heard last month. We've also created some changes related to property maintenance to our code of ordinances. We've made it the review process. We haven't made any changes to it, but we've made it easier to understand. And the key thing is we've added some user-friendly matrices and tables that consolidates a lot of the information. So if you're working on our front zoning counter or you're in the public looking something up, there's a logical place. You kind of see all the information that you need in one table. So it doesn't require you to go flipping through the thing, multiple references, and it takes out a lot of confusion out of what we're going to do operationally. So the improved land development code is allowed within limitations imposed by the comp plan. So the code has been reorganized really comprehensively. We've consolidated also a lot of the chapters. A lot of the regulations that were engineering related obviously have been moved to those manuals. And the key thing is, I keep stressing those tables. And for our staff that works on the zoning counter, answering phone calls, this even allows us to answer phone calls quicker because we have the information right there in front of us. We've also, during that 3-day workshop we had last year, remember many of y'all participated in that. We appreciate your time with that. If you recall, during that time, we had a draft code then, and there were some things that the Planning Commission, the board gave us direction on to say, this item definitely do in phase 1, let's do this other item in phase 2. And this is the result of those comments and changes made. Now I'd like to turn it over to Mr. Clegg, and he has some comments from the County Attorney's Office. Bill?
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the Planning Commission. I only have a few quick remarks. This is, of course, a legislative process. Every local government is required under Florida law to maintain a land development code that implements its comprehensive plan. Manatee County's code over the years has not been maintained as well as it should have been. That's been an ongoing issue in the 12 years I've been here. It was an issue when I got here, and this is an effort by staff to begin to correct that legacy issue. Many of the provisions in the code have not been revised or updated since it was originally adopted in 1991 or 90. I don't remember which, 90. So they go back a long way, but the world is not static. Things change, the law changes, statutes change, and it's our obligation as a county government to keep the code up to date. There have been a lot of piecemeal changes over the years where amendments have been tacked on here or there without a sort of comprehensive thought about how the code's organized. And the result of that is that it is a poorly organized code, and in many cases issues are scattered throughout the code. It's tough to find an issue in the code. You might have to look in multiple places. Staff struggles with it, applicants struggle with it, the public struggles with it. Many of the definitions and terms are out of sync. There are references to directors of departments that haven't existed in the county for years, in some cases even decades. So those things have to be corrected, and we have to bring the code into alignment with current practices and Florida statutes. And as John mentioned, there are also internal inconsistencies where you might look in one place and see things stated one way, and then you look somewhere else and there's language addressing the same issue, but it doesn't really jive with what you just read in another spot. And finally, there's a lot of reliance on interpretation over the years. So there's many things that the staff has been handling for years as interpretations of the code that haven't been incorporated into the code the way they need to be. Now, there's been a lot of talk about major policy decisions, how will we grow, and various other studies, and wanting to change some policies and look at the way we do things in the county as far as growth management. But there's a strong feeling among staff and the consultant that it's going to be very difficult to take on those issues while the code is still convoluted, disorganized. So the first step, which you have in front of you today, is to try to get things reorganized and get issues put all in one place so that you don't run the risk that if you try to make a change on a particular issue, that you miss it in another spot in the code. It's very difficult right now to take on policy questions the way the code is set up at present, and this is an effort to correct that. So what you see is a carryover of the current policies into a new code that's in front of you, or a restated code, but not changes to those policies. And the Planning Commission, and when this gets to the board should keep that in mind, that the only substantive changes in here are fairly minor, and they are substantive changes that are needed to bring the code into compliance with Florida statutes. They're down at the Scrivener's level. The ordinance and the process are not set up to reevaluate the merits of every policy that's in the code today. And so it's easy to open this new code up and read it and be surprised to see some things that have actually been in the code for years but have been hard to find. But they're now more readily apparent. So there may be a desire of some people to say, let's change those things, that they don't agree with them. That's going to have to be dealt with in subsequent phases, and it's going to be hard to get to that point if we can't get the code reorganized first so that we can look at those issues in a coherent way and make sure that we're not missing something or doing something that we don't intend to do. So that concludes my remarks.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Clegg. Before we move on to the next element, you mentioned policies, establishing or clarifying policies. Just to understand, when we talk about policies, we're talking about policies based on the code, not somebody's interpretation of something that's a little bit convoluted and it can't be tied back to code, correct?
That is correct. And when I say policies, I mean, there's nothing here that changes what's allowed in a neighborhood, for example, or what kind of development can take place where, or whether it does or does not go to the Board of County Commissioners. We have had to exercise a lot of self-discipline to avoid opening up those issues and to just carry over what is in the code now and just clean it up and put it all in one place so people can see it and understand it, and not open up those issues for consideration. And we haven't advertised this to open up those issues for consideration. So there may be people who want to, but it's not something that we can say from a legal standpoint we're comfortable doing in this phase.
Correct. Thank you very much. Thank you. Mr. Ratledge, you have a
In
comment or
following up
question?
with that, so where, for example, there's terminology that has been the practice to deem that to mean a certain thing, you have not kind of galvanized that in this document?
I would say no, we have not. We have not attempted to address those issues in this document.
'Cause, I mean, that's
Because
kind
of
of
the
the
risk
practice,
of
right?
opening a controversy that really we're not ready to deal with at this point. At this point, we're just trying to get things better organized so people can understand what the code does say right now on any given issue.
So similar to the standard manuals, this is a modification of the form of code, not the function of the code.
That is exactly correct.
Thank you, thank you. All right, thank you, I'm sorry.
Good
Oh, I'm
morning.
sorry, I'm sorry.
Just 1 minute. John, you referred to the meetings that we had before. I think it was 2 or 3 days, and most of us attended those. So all the discussion that took place, we're moving this, and this is the justification and the rationale behind it, that's basically the end result that we're looking at today with
Yep.
these changes and movements?
Yes, sir. The board and the planning commission, during those 3 days, gave us explicit direction on do this in phase one, wait on this till phase two. And what you see today is the results of that direction.
I would also like to clarify, it's not the end result, it's the beginning of the
Yes.
process.
Correct.
Yeah.
We're at the
That is
very
true.
beginning, we're not at the end. So there's going to be a lot of opportunity for input as we go through the code and start making substantial changes to some of the other elements that would be open for discussion. I don't know, they may be substantial, they may be minor, but that's going to come at a later date. Mr. Rutledge.
So for the, as I understand it, the electronic submission process that's been used recently was before, occurred after the 1990, that's not addressed, or that is addressed, you know?
I'm sorry, sir, in terms of submitting something to
Yeah,
the
the
county to
electronic
review?
submission that you guys have kind of developed over some recent years as opposed to the old format that would have spoken this way. Are those things addressed, or the change in technology in it?
There's a few things where we had some changes related to technology. We don't really get into the details of how a site plan is submitted with this code amendment. But I think Mr. Gerstenberger had some changes to the engineering standards manual that reflected, well, you don't bring a floppy in anymore and things like that.
Right, well, that's, okay. But it recognizes that that's part of the conduct.
Correct, yes.
Thanks.
And again, I would like to emphasize that the form of the code is being held, the function of the code is being held, it's the form that's being modified. At a later date, I think there'd be more opportunity to hash out some of the finer details of some of the processes, so, thank you. I'm sorry,
No problem.
go ahead.
Good morning. Just a quick introduction. My name is Pat Chayeski. I'm a senior planner with Little John Engineering Associates. And what I'm going to do with my side of the presentation, I'm just going to explain to you how we made the changes, what the drafts look like, what the different colors and underlines mean, so that when you get these drafts, you know exactly what you're looking at. So starting with, if we can click to the next one, the numbering of the code changed. We realized that the way it was numbered was not consistent throughout. It was hard to find the level a section was at, so we decided to create a new numbering system. And we used track changes in Microsoft Word. It's a great tool. It works 90% of the time, but there are some areas where it's just really hard to fight against it. So you may see sometimes like 3 different section numbers, and it is because we have made so many changes that at some point Word can't remember what was the original number. But we have figured out how to keep track of all that, and I'll show it to you in the next slide. Something else that you're going to see in the printouts, I'm doing this, I'm sorry. Whenever we add something to the text, it comes out as underlined. If you open the Word file in my computer versus somebody else's computer, the colors vary, but we made PDFs, and that's one of the reasons why we make PDFs. So we are all looking at the same colors. So anything that is new, you're going to see it as underlined and blue. Anything that was deleted is going to be shown as red with the strike through. Another tool that is really good in Word is whenever you move text from one section to another, it shows it with double strike through and double underline, and it's shown in green. That way you know that even though it's underlined, it's not something that is brand new, it just came from somewhere else. And again, Word not always cooperates with this, so if we tried and it was not showing it as green, we just put a footnote or a comment saying this section is not new, it was just moved from, and then we provide the number. You're going to see some highlighted text in your drafts. We have been working on these drafts for several years, and because we have been moving things around every time, cross-references were constantly changing. So what we do is we highlight all the cross-references to make sure that at the very end, when we're ready to submit to MuniCode, we know that we have to go through all those yellow highlights and make sure that that's the correct number. So you'll know that, you may find some right now that are not correct, but that will be all fixed. Something else that your drafts are going to show, whenever we add a comment to a section, the comment comes out as a balloon. That's what Microsoft Word calls them, balloons on the right margin. Other drafts, you might see them as just footnotes. Oops, what happened here? It may say LDI 3 or LEA 7, and basically there would be a page at the very end of the document that has all the list of comments. You're going to see notes like, please know that this cross-reference refers to a section that no longer exists, so we put the one that we think belongs in there. Or it may say this is something that we should address in phase 2, or it may say something like staff asked us to change this, or the county attorney's office recommended that we change that. You're going to see those comments, and all that is going to disappear whenever we're done adopting and sending it to MuniCode. Now, I mentioned before that we try to keep track of the numbering system. Sometimes we would get people calling and saying, what happened to section 103.7? I can't find it anywhere. Because we moved things from chapter to chapter, it was really hard to, have somebody say, well, look through the other chapters, maybe it's somewhere else in there. So we created an index. The first column shows you the original section number, so what's in the code right now. It's shown as strike through in red because we deleted that number and created a new number for all those sections, so that's your second column. So if you're looking for section, for example, section 104.3 used to be in chapter 1, now it's going to be in your chapter 4, and it's going to be in section 400.4. So this is a very useful tool to know where things went. Now, the last column shows you, for example, section 101.243, the title stayed the same. It's public schools. If you look down below, there is one that was called zoning districts. Now we deleted one word, no big deal. Now, you're going to see that some were completely deleted. It can mean two things. One, we either took the whole section out of the code, but you can find that deleted text under this section 107.9, or we simply deleted the text of the title. And I'll explain that in detail a little bit later. So this index, just the index alone, is about 80 pages. That shows you how many numbered sections you had in the code before. If you make a list of just the new section numbers, it's a lot less than 80 pages. Okay, in terms of general changes that we made throughout the code, John touched on this a little bit before, but I wanted to restate it. So it was complete reorganization, moving, consolidating, deleting repetitive language, and we found a lot of that. deleted some titles and added others for consistency. So sometimes you would get to section 407.3 and you had A through G. And then A, D, and E would have subtitles, but the others didn't. So we either added subtitles to the others if we felt it was necessary, or we just deleted the subtitles of those that had it. So it was consistent. Cross-references, I mentioned that sometimes we found that were nowhere to be found, so we fixed those. Other times, it would refer you to a very specific section of the code, like 504.3.2, A, little 1, little a, whatever. Because we know that these codes change over time, we feel that it is completely unnecessary to go to that detail. You just refer to the major section, the general section, and people will be able to find it. References to Florida statutes, administrative code, and other documents, all those were updated. The department director, this is something that as the county evolves, the departments change, position titles change. We came up with a very generic title to use throughout the code. It's department director. And that is defined, and it says he's a county administrator or designee. So whoever the county administrator determines that will be the keeper of the code, that is who the department director will be. So whether it's building and development services or planning or whatever name comes in the future, that would be addressed. And then we're going to talk about some of these new sections. There were certain things that were in practice today that were not in the code. We put them in. Now they're going to show us new. It doesn't mean it's new practice. It just means that we're codifying that. Now let's talk about the outline. So right now you have 13 chapters. And some chapters are sort of easy to figure out what they include, like definitions. You know what it's going to be in there. But when you go down to development standards of general applicability, it is a mix of all different types of standards and regulations. So if I say to you, go to the parking chapter, where do I find parking standards or sign standards? It's kind of hard to know where to find stuff. So the new outline looks like this. And I'm going to go chapter by chapter explaining to you where things went. So purpose and applicability, stayed in chapter 1. Definitions, stayed as chapter 2. There is a report, I believe it's the Matrix report, that recommended that definitions be moved to the very end of the code. And for a while, we had put it at the end of the code. But then realized that if later on somebody decides to add a chapter of the code, then your definitions are not at the end of the code. Now they are in the middle of the code somewhere. So we felt that the chapter number 2 was the best place for your definitions. Your chapter 3, decision-making and administrative bodies, it's still a chapter 3, but right now we're calling it review authority and procedures. So we're combining those two into a single chapter. Design guidelines was moved to later in the code. Development review procedures, like I mentioned, was combined with your review authorities. Zoning chapter stayed the same. The development standards of general applicability, so that included standards for accessory structures, specific standards for uses, temporary uses, so they all went to chapter 5. Anything that was related to signs went to a new chapter, 6. If it had to do with engineering standards, it went to a chapter that is just called that, engineering standards. Then we also had like parking and some transportation standards. All that went to chapter 10, which is a transportation manual. Impact fees stayed the same. Subdivision procedures and standards, whatever was related to a standard went to the engineering chapter. But whatever had to do with the procedure went to the procedures chapter. So that was a complete separation of sections. Development agreements went to your development review chapter. Nonconformities, we moved that to chapter 1. Enforcement was also moved to chapter 1. On housing program, this is one that we kind of debated where to put it, and it ended up going to chapter 5. So I'm going to go chapter by chapter, explaining to you what the chapter contains and what kind of changes we made to those chapters. So I mentioned that chapter 1 remained chapter 1, general provisions. So it's kind of like your introduction to the code, who is in charge of the code, who it applies to, consistency with the comprehensive plan, the rules for interpretation, and then we go into enforcement, violations, penalties, and that type of stuff. So before, chapter 1 was very, very short. By combining the introduction to the code and provisions related to enforcement, it made it a more complete chapter. Nonconformities are now in this chapter too. And then we added a small section at the very end explaining the Public Works Manual, because even though it was mentioned throughout the code, there was not a single section that would establish that document as, being tied to the Land Development Code. The only change that we made here was delete a provision that had a specific date for enforcement, and that date passed, so we no longer need that, so that came out. Your definitions chapter, it includes definitions, but it includes a section that has all kinds of abbreviations and acronyms. And as you know, we have a lot of those, and sometimes people forget what they mean, or new people don't even know what they are, so it's great to find them in this chapter. In your staff report, you have a very detailed explanation on what we did to the definitions chapter. We had to add new definitions for some terms that were not defined in the code. We deleted some definitions of terms that were not even used anywhere in the code. In some instances, we changed a name, trying to, thinking about clarification, making things more easier to identify. So we made some changes in the names. Sometimes we rewrote some definitions, not trying to change the meaning, but just trying to make them easier to understand. And then we also had to rewrite some to be sure we were consistent with the comprehensive plan and the statutes. Now moving on to chapter 3. So I mentioned that we have a part that has to do with the review authority, the committees, bodies, board, explaining what they do, membership, and the types of applications that they review. And then we go into a whole section that includes all the types of development review that you have to go through when you have a development application. And we explain, we have administrative permit and special permit, site plan review, subdivision procedures, comp plans, land development code and zoning amendments, other applications, things like certificate of appropriateness, certificate of level of service. We combine the little ones into one section, concurrency management. Then we have a section on variances and modifications and appeals. So some of the changes that you'll see in this chapter. We established a DRC. Nothing new. It's something that has been in practice for many years, but it needed to be in the code so people knew what the DRC was about and what they review and what they do. There were some changes to the language regarding development orders, and it was more just specifying when they're required, what kind of exceptions there are, the type of review and approval, the effect of when you get one approved, and the recording. The sections that dealt with the building permit and certificates of occupancy, a lot of that is in the building code and didn't need to be in the land development code. It's duplication that could be dangerous. Once the building code changes, then you would have to come in and change the LDC. So that was trimmed down substantially. There was something as obvious as, you have to have permit before you start construction. So there was some new language added to that effect. Neighborhood workshops, this is something that has been done in the past, but it was not explained anywhere in the code. We created a development review table and a public notice table. I'm going to show you those two as examples of how we're trying to present this information so people can understand it better. So this table lists all the different types of application that you would be submitting to the county. Then it has a column that says, if you're considering a preliminary plat, go to section 333 because that's where you're going to have all the information you need to know for plats. And then it tells you whether it's quasi-judicial or legislative, whether you need a pre-app meeting, DRC meeting, and who the approval authority is. So if you have a general development plan, where is my last stop? Your last stop would be with the board. So this table helps put all that in just one page so people can easily see what the process is like. Public notice, it was all text before. We preserved a lot of the text, but we also created a table so that people know, okay, so it's mail notice, posted notice, whatever it is that they need to do. In terms of the each one of the applications, we try to have consistent headings like purpose of the review. Why would the county be looking at a site plan? Why would they be reviewing a change to a historic structure? Applicability. Okay, so I'm changing historic structure. When do I have to apply for this certificate of appropriateness? So that's, how does it apply to me? Then we go into the review steps. Okay, so I need to do pre-app, neighborhood workshop. Do I go to DRC? That's where it's all spelled out. Expiration of approvals. If I get a site plan approved, how long can I have that before it expires? Extensions. modifications. If I have something approved, I need to make a change, how do I make that change? And we found a lot of standards as we were going through the procedures. All those standards were taken out of there. So, they were moved to the standards chapters. By having all these titles, we realized that sometimes they were not clear in the code, so we had to add language saying, okay, if it expires, you need to do this and this and that. It's not something new, it was that it was not spelled out or it was lumped with something else in the code. For subdivisions, we had a lot of changes. Basically, we deleted repetition to Florida statutes. Sometimes it's good to repeat what the statutes say. It's kind of user-friendly, but at the same time, if the statutes change and you don't change the code, all of a sudden you end up with conflicts. There was a section on lot consolidation and reconfiguration that is not needed anymore, so we took it out. And again, standards, there are no standards in this chapter. It's all has to do with procedures, steps to get your application approved. We added a section on comprehensive plan amendments, just explaining to somebody what kind of review process they would have to go with the county. We had plan development criteria included in the procedures, like you would say when the board approves the PD, they have to make sure that they meet blah, 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 blah. Well, all those standards were repetition of what was in your zoning chapter. So all that was taken out. Doesn't mean that they're not there anymore. It means they were in the wrong chapter. There's a new section called the zoning compliance permit. Sometimes you're going to do a special use or a type of use that it's going to be in an existing building. You don't need to go through site plan or any of those reviews, but you do need to check to make sure that the zoning is correct and that you get a permit to do that. We wrote a section to address that. Development agreements, this is something that the county attorney was talking about. In 2005, this section was supposed to be deleted. There was an ordinance adopted, and it said this section needs to go out. It was still in the code, so we took it out. It's not a decision that we made at this time or that we're making at this time. It was something that was decided in 2005, so all that's taken out. Certificates of appropriateness. We found a few things that could have been improved, but because the state has oversight on that ordinance, they need to know what kind of changes you're making. We figured that it would be better to leave those for later so that we can work hand in hand with the state on those changes. So we made notes. You're going to see notes that say, this section needs to be fixed to whatever. That will be done at a later phase. And the proportionate share program, that was eliminated by the state recently, so it's no longer needed. This chapter now includes a section that deals with types of modifications that you could get approved, all the way from modification of standards to administrative adjustments to variances. Your administrative adjustments, that used to be called administrative variances, because of the nature of a variance, the fact that they're tied to hardships and all that, we wanted to change the name because the idea of the administrative variances or adjustments is different. So we changed that name. And then the very last section of that chapter is your appeals section. Okay, now the first 5 chapters are extensive. From there on, it's going to be really fast, so bear with me. For the zoning chapter, basically it includes 4 sections, 4 major sections. Generally, all the general rules for zoning. Then we go into the standard zoning districts. Then we go into plan development districts and overlay districts. In the general section, we started by including a table that was buried on your website somewhere that basically says, if your future land use category is this, you could have these zoning districts. So we took that table, put it here so that now when people come for rezonings and staff says, sorry, you cannot rezone to that because it's not consistent with your comp plan, well, they can see what other zoning districts they can consider within their future land use classification. So we made just a couple of changes to make it more current, but it's going to be a lot of help to have that table there. For your standard zoning districts, the major change that we made, we created a consolidated table that is going to show a list of uses. Then the second column is going to say, okay, if you happen to be planning to have an aircraft landing field, please know that Section 531.2 has additional standards that you need to meet. In the past, or I should say with the current code, you have been calling it conditional uses, meaning this use is subject to conditions, but the conditional use term statewide has a different meaning. If you think of special exception, conditional use, or here special permit, we wanted to stay away from that term because that having additional standards doesn't mean that you have to go through any type of public hearing. It doesn't mean that you have to have special approval for something like that. It only means that because it's a daycare, we're going to have special standards for drop-off or hours of operation or something like that. So we're trying to stay away from that term, conditional use, and we're just calling it specific uses that have specific standards. So that's what that column is about. And then the other columns, they look pretty much the same way that yours used to look like, except that this is, we went from like 20 tables to just 2 tables. It shows whether the use is permitted, or if it requires administrative permit, special permit, or simply not permitted by the X. In terms of the list of uses, we tried to do some consolidation. Right now, the code uses the SIC code, and it's really long, and many times there are some uses mentioned that nobody ever has come to the county to, get one approved. So we worked with staff to try to make those, the list of uses a little bit more general. So instead of specifying the 10 different types of offices that you can have, we did just 2 major categories, professional and medical. So that type of change was made. Then the other set of tables that you'll find in this chapter is what we call the dimensional standards tables. And we found dimensional standards throughout your code, and we tried to bring them all to this table. And if you want to know what the setbacks are for each one of your districts, you can find it here in this table. Now, for the plan development districts, we didn't make any changes. There was some discussion at some point trying to, streamline and trim it down, but we are not making any changes at this point. They're going to stay the way that they are in the current code. For your overlay districts, we included a table that shows all the overlays that you have. And in terms of changes, what we did was consolidate certain things. Like, for example, you had one section that had to do with airport noise in one section, and you had to go to a different section to talk about height when you're around an airport. We put those in the same section. You have the North County Gateway Overlay. The name was changed to reflect, I think, what the county had already decided. This is something that people may panic. So the Parish Commercial Village overlay standards, they may go to that chapter and go, wow, they were deleted, what happened? Well, no, those were dimensional standards, so we moved them to the table. So you'll find them there. We didn't change them. We didn't change setbacks or anything like that. The historic landmark designation, again, this is something that we'll address later on. Now, you have 2 watershed districts. And when we were reading those sections, they read exactly the same word by word, except for 2 minor things. So we consolidated them into one, making sure that we preserve the difference. So instead of saying, and the setback if you're within this district must be 50 feet, but if you're in that other district, it's 75 feet. So the regulation is still the same, but less wording. Okay, chapter 5. So this chapter is where we have standards for accessory structures, temporary uses, those specific uses that I mentioned in your zoning chapter. So if you have a daycare, you have to come here to see what standards you have. And then we also included here anything that has to do with adverse impact performance standards, noise, odor, what's the other one? Noise, there's another one. Air, and special use programs, and that's your housing program. In terms of accessory structures, something as simple as, realizing that now a lot of people use the small dish antennas. We needed an exception to that. There was a lot of cross-referencing. So it would say, going back to the daycare, and you have to make sure you meet the landscape chapter, and don't forget your parking chapter. And it's like, if you mention those 2, how come you're not mentioning all the other chapters? Because they have to meet the whole code anyway. So we got rid of all those double, triple references in that chapter. Fences, this is one of those substantial changes. We added 2 materials to it, so that's something that you didn't have in the code before, but we feel that it's necessary to make that change. Garage sales, all that was moved to the property maintenance code. Junk vehicles, refuse moved to property maintenance code. The swimming pool standards, anything that had to do with the building code was deleted because the building code regulates that anyway. The procedures for approving temporary uses was moved to the procedures chapter. And then For retail, this is something that people get really confused because you come and you look at your code and, okay, I'm going to do retail. That's where it's allowed. Those are my setbacks. Good. I go and design my site plan and then later realize that, oh, the comprehensive plan has standards too. So this is something that we have tried to consolidate and make sure that they're consistent. So we brought some of your comprehensive plan standards to the code. We're not taking them out of the comp plan just yet, but we felt that it was necessary to have them in a place where people can find them. So you may find some new language in the code now regarding retail standards, and it's just language that came from your comprehensive plan. Chapter 6 has to do with signs, cleaned up and updated cross-references, and brought some standards that were included in your definition section. We brought them to where they belong. Environmental and cultural resource protection. This chapter is going to include your tree protection, landscaping and buffers, natural resource protection, and historic, cultural, and archaeological resources. Earth moving, for example, was in a chapter of what you call right now conditional uses. It's not really a type of use. It had something to do more with the environmental protection, so we moved it to this chapter. We noticed that there is a lot of it in the Code of Ordinances too. We didn't try to make that consolidation or consistency check, but we know that in the future that has to be checked to make sure that they're both consistent and not repetitive. Deleted some provisions regarding no-wake zones and slow speed zones because they're already in the Code of Ordinances and they have been updated. So this that was left in the code was all outdated, so we deleted them. And again, there are some future revisions to the historic preservation section in this chapter. Engineering. In terms of the contents of your engineering chapter, you have subdivision requirements, not process anymore, stormwater management, floodplain, utilities, open space, easements, and outdoor lighting. The procedures for subdivisions were moved out to Chapter 3, and engineering standards, detailed standards were moved to the Public Works manuals. Your design guidelines, this is where we have standards for entranceways and for the Cortez Fishing Village. There was some rewording, punctuation, cleaning up, but nothing changed. Chapter 10 now includes anything that has to do with streets and parking, basically. We moved several provisions to the Public Works manual, but everything else pretty much stayed the same. Your parking table, we cleaned that up a little bit so that it's easier to find the requirements. And your impact fees chapter, again, rewarding, punctuation, we didn't change anything in this chapter. So, where do we go from here? From here, we're going to go to the board, and the first reading of the ordinance is going to be on May 7th. And then from there, the second reading will be June 4th. And those would be, again, opportunities for public hearing. And then John is going to tell you a little bit about what comes beyond those dates.
Does this have to be transmitted to the state for review?
John Osborne, planning official. No, this is an ordinance we would adopt on our own here in Manatee County.
Okay, there's no, even though we established, I guess, or maybe it's the compliance with the comprehensive plan, it doesn't actually.
It's not like a plan amendment where there's a transmittal and a org report like they had back in the day. There's nothing like that with this.
Okay, thank you.
Just last couple things, commissioners. This is not the subject of today, but some of the future things you're going to see from us. As I mentioned in the first couple slides, we once had a draft of a land development code rewrite that was much more comprehensive. All is not lost with that original draft. We're going to be bringing some things back individually as well in the future. The first thing we're going to be working on that's starting, it might not be come to your the next hearing you get first, but we're starting on is some work on the urban core. And this has actually been a policy in our comp plan since probably was adopted in 1990. It basically said that the county needs to consider an alternative land development code for our older and established areas. What we're starting with is doing some work along some of the major corridors in the southwest portion of Manatee County, not the neighborhoods, but the corridors, the properties along our major corridors. Many of you have been in the private sector or even just on the public side, have experienced many issues when people try to redevelop something or do infill development along our corridors. Some of those original buildings were built back in before we had a land development code, and sometimes it's very difficult to go rebuild something to those same sort of standards. Our our land development code is very suburban oriented. So we're looking at, we're going to be doing some workshops on that with the public and the business owners along these major corridors in the southwest portion of the county. So this will be a project, again, that is just focused on the corridors along in the southwest portion of the county. There's also another phase, and this we'll work on probably likely simultaneously, but there's also some outstanding items from that 3-day work session that we're going to be bringing back. And there's also some additional items that we need to work with the county attorney's office on some changes that also brings our codes more into compliance with Florida statutes and the way things have changed in recent years. So there's a few more things coming. But with that, we're here for any questions, sir.
Okay, are there any questions for staff? Mr.
Not a
Rhodes?
question. I just want to make a comment, John, and to Ms. Tajinski. Something that I'm going to repeat that I sort of said at the end of the workshop session. This was a very important, large, comprehensive task. And the attention to detail, I think that we all realize was of utmost importance. And heads off to you for the great job that you did, because all of us who have been in business at some time have done something like this and been involved in it, and I understand the detail and the sweat and the coordination that's needed. So great job to all of you for this on the much-needed rewrite of what we're calling Phase 1 here.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Rhodes. Mr. Rutledge?
Yeah, first of all, I concur 100%. This is fabulous, and having been on the other side of this, thank God. You know, I mean, it's great for the county and the community as a whole. So I think that's great. I had a couple of questions, though. One of the questions I asked our counsel here was whether in writing the descriptions and some of the codes, whether you were galvanizing the practice that may have actually been in written form from chair heads or so forth about what was to be done, whether that was being included. And your statement was it was, and I got the impression that it wasn't. So you tell me which is the correct answer in my mind. So.
Do you have a specific example, sir?
No. So I'm thinking of things where you come in and they say, well, you know, it used to be that you brought in a submission that had to have this kind of thing, but the interpretation now is, compact size cars might be used versus when it's just said parking, and we've now determined that compacts are acceptable, and so we use that as a practice, but it's not written. And it sounds like you've now included that because it's a practice and it's maybe been vetted through time, and so.
A great example is the Development Review Committee. Most people, hasn't been in our code ever, but we started the Development Review Committee several years ago, again, to provide some clear direction to our applicants, and also have another opportunity for the public to come in and just watch and see the conversation between staff and applicants and other agencies. So that is something we put in there that has been a practice for years, and it needed to be in there, it needed to be reflected in there, that we do have that as part of our processes. We don't want to surprise people. Most other communities in our area, or even in Florida, utilize a development review committee. It's a very standard practice to get everything squared away comment-wise, so you don't have conflicting comments from one reviewer to another, which in the past, before we had a DRC, happened a lot. And it caused this whole cycle of review submittals to keep going and going and going, and never got fixed. But we fix it all at once now in one meeting and get everybody consistent with the code in one fell swoop.
Totally in support of that. Again, I just want to kind of understand. So in addition, would any of these things that have been included like that be things that have been documented in some way to say this is our practice? And so it's vetted not just by an engineering group. I just want to make sure I understand, because the representation, which I think is key to making this very easy to solve, is we're not kind of changing the code. And so I guess I'm just trying to understand that. My lack of experience may be part of my problem.
Bill wants to chime
Yeah, I think we need to distinguish between standards and the practices of managing our process. Because, for example, there's just an example that comes to mind, John, is the dual required access and the boulevard access mechanism of complying with that. That's an interpretation in our code, has been for years, that you could meet the dual access requirement with a boulevard access. It is not written in our current code. We have not addressed that in this update. That is an issue to deal with as a substantive policy question later. But things like who reviews what, which department looks at what, the planning and building department that is referenced in the current code that hasn't really existed in years. That has been fixed. So when we talk about current practices, I did say in my remarks, we have updated things to reflect our current practices in terms of our review and management of applications. But in terms of substantive development standards and interpretations of the code that decide what is allowed and what is not allowed, we have not attempted to address that in this update. And I can see staff nodding their heads because they live and breathe this stuff every day in terms of how we handle our applications. So I hope that helps.
Yeah,
for
I
you to
think-
understand the distinction.
And again, forgive me, because I want to make sure that if asked or in voting, that it's clear to me that what we're not trying to do is, and you know what the concern's going to be, oh, well, they slipped in this one because they like it, and the staff thinks, oh, this is the way it should be. And so it's clearly just the mechanics of, there's no more floppy disks, there's this practice that we have, and that kind of thing. So, okay, I'm comfortable, and I understand what you're saying. There's some things that are kind of the mechanics of what you're doing that's not really code, and I get that. So, okay, that's
There's
helpful.
others that are substantive policies, and that's what we have avoided in terms
Understood.
of
Okay,
of
thanks.
addressing
Not
the
to
interpretation issue.
And with regard to like the Development Review Committee, that's more a narrative that explains the process. I think it's a more descriptive section now that tells you details of what the process is, as opposed to adding a new process. If it were adding a DRC, I think you'd have a lot of people sitting in the
Right, that's what I
in the audience here.
Okay, thank you. And a fabulous job. This is great stuff, I think.
Thank you.
Boy.
Uh-oh.
Mr. Chairman, Commissioners, John Barnott, Director of Building Development Services. I would be remiss if I let this opportunity go by to recognize a number of people that have put a lot of effort into this task. The County Attorney's Office, Bill and Sarah, have spent countless hours reviewing this stuff. Pat and her organization, Lisa, Margaret, Robin, Tom, of course, John, and a lot of people, Bob Schmidt, not here anymore. A lot of people have put a lot of blood, sweat, and tears in this thing because they believe in what they're doing, and this is the right thing to do. It's a reorganization. I listened to your remarks coming in from another meeting, and I thought they were very apropos, Mr. Clegg.
Thank you.
You hit the nail on the head. But we think this is a great product, a great beginning point. And you're right, Commissioner Rhodes. A lot of people work very hard on this. So I want to publicly thank all those folks for doing that. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Barnett.
Good.
And again, as a user of the Land Development Code in the past, this was needed. The world has evolved, and the Land Development Code didn't necessarily evolve with it. So it's a much needed and appreciated effort. Thank you very much. Are there any other questions, comments, or concerns?
You need to take public comment.
Can I ask
Okay.
one other question? The
Yes.
CRA districts that are part of the community, they're not detailed. I saw you had some categories for specific areas. Is there anything specific?
Commissioner, we do have obviously overlay districts still, but the two community redevelopment areas are no longer in existence in the county. We do have a tax increment finance district in a couple different places, but those don't have any specific land development regulations tied to them.
Okay.
But the CRAs are gone.
Okay. Anything else? This isn't quasi-judicial, is that
It's
correct?
not, but it is a public hearing.
So
we do need to take
if
public
if
comment.
there's anybody in the public who wishes to speak, you can come up. You don't need to be sworn. Clark, you look like you're ready to go into motion. Okay. All right. Seeing nobody come forward, we're going to close the public hearing, and the chair will entertain a motion.
I'll make a motion.
Mr.
Chairman.
Rhodes.
I move to recommend the approval of the Land Development Code rewrite Phase 1 per the recommended motion in the staff report attached to the agenda memo.
Thank you, Mr. Rhodes. We have a motion. Is there a second?
Second?
Mr. Gillesline, second. All those in favor, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Chair votes aye. Motion carries. So,
Thank you all. I appreciate that.
Thank you very much.
Great
Thank you.
stuff.
Thank you very much. That concludes our published agenda. Are there any other items that any of the commissioners, staff would like to?
I'm sorry, sir, go ahead.
Yes, Ms. Shank.
Excuse me, Mr. Chairman, Sarah Shank, Assistant County Attorney for the record. Because this is the entire Land Development Code and extremely important, could I trouble the board to actually read the motion?
Ma'am.
It's because the final consistency of the concept plan is in here. It's on page 4 of your staff report.
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. Okay, we're going to revisit the motion. Mr. Rhodes, we're going to open
have
this back
to-
up for discussion.
Okay?
I'm sorry, not for discussion, for action.
I have to get to it then.
Let me also state that we're reopening the public hearing.
Does the clerk have it?
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Clegg, usually when staff will, the commissioners state the motion that's listed in the recommended
Okay,
you know, agenda package, I generally type that in, so.
Okay, I believe I have it here, okay? Based upon recommended motion, based upon the staff report, evidence presented, comments made at the public hearing, and the finding request to be consistent with the Manatee County Comprehensive Plan as conditioned herein, I move to recommend adoption of the Manatee County Ordinance 15-17.
Thank you, Mr. Rhodes. We have an amended motion. Is there?
Still second.
Still second, Mr. Delazline. If we could, please signify by saying, establishing your, your vote again. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Chair again votes aye. Motion carries, and we're going to close the public hearing. Are there any other items that, Mr. Osborne, I believe you had something?
Yes, sir. Just one last thing. On April 14th at 9 a.m., our Board of County Commissioners is having a work session on the Phase 2 Land Development Code Rewrite that I mentioned previously. The Planning Commission representatives are welcome to attend that. However, we will be presenting that to you at a future work session date as well. Just wanted to let you all know.
Thank you very much. There was some discussion about having a joint work session. Is that
We'll be coordinating with that in the future, sir.
future? Okay, thank you very much. And then one final matter, Mr. Osborne. We discussed having somebody from the University of Florida come in for training. Is that likely to occur at the next commission meeting?
It is likely it will occur at the next commission meeting.
Okay, so we've been having, last two meetings, we've had work sessions. Is that still something we'll have, or will the extended planning commission with the work session after?
This would be an end of your normal agenda work session. So it
So
would be in
the-
the morning, it would be afterwards.
Okay, so let's just establish now that the meeting will begin at 9 o'clock. There won't be any 8:30 work session, so, okay. All right, any other matters? Anything else for the good of the order? Nothing? All right, we're going to close the meeting. Thank you very much. Meeting closed.